The great warship called the Throne of Eternity hung in the darkness of space like a mountain made of metal and light. And inside its golden halls, the most powerful beings in the galaxy had gathered to decide the fate of 1,000,000,000,000 lives. High Regent Salreth Kine stood at the center of the command chamber with his 4 arms crossed over his chest, his silver scales catching the light from 100 floating screens that showed maps of dying star systems. He was the ruler of the Valanthi Dominion, an empire that had conquered worlds when humanity was still living in caves and hunting animals with sharp rocks. The Harrow Swarm has consumed 17 systems in the past cycle, Salreth announced to the assembled delegates, his voice deep and filled with the weight of 10,000 years of authority. They will reach the inner territories within 20 rotations if we do not act. Around him stood representatives from 12 spacefaring civilizations, each one ancient and proud and certain of their own superiority. The Crethani with their crystalline bodies that hummed with electromagnetic energy, the Morvathi whose tentacles could crush starship hulls, the Delvari whose minds could process battle calculations faster than any computer, and 8 others, all of them species that had ruled the stars for centuries or millennia. And then there were the humans. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood near the back of the chamber with her small delegation, dressed in the finest ceremonial robes that Earth could provide. And beside her stood a man in simple gray clothes who carried a battered datapad and said nothing at all. His name was Marcus Cole, and every alien in the room assumed he was a servant. Marcus watched the proceedings with quiet eyes that missed nothing, and when a Valanthi officer walked past him and shoved an empty tray into his hands with a dismissive grunt, he simply nodded and set it aside without complaint. Ambassador Chen opened her mouth to protest this insult, but Marcus caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. She understood, though it clearly pained her to stay silent. Humanity offers 12 vessels to the Coalition fleet, Ambassador Chen announced when it was her turn to speak, and the chamber filled with sounds that might have been laughter from a dozen different species. 12 vessels, sneered Admiral Korath, the Valanthi fleet commander whose body was covered in battle scars and medals of honor. The Morvathi bring 3,000, the Crethani bring 2,000, and the young humans bring 12. Perhaps they can carry supplies for the real warriors. More laughter echoed through the golden chamber, and Marcus simply stood there with his datapad, recording notes like any good servant would, his face showing nothing but polite attention. The summit continued for hours as the alien powers argued about fleet positions and command structures, and who would have the honor of leading the combined armada against the swarm. Ancient rivalries that had been sleeping for centuries woke up and began to poison every discussion. The Morvathi refused to serve under Valanthi command because of a war that had ended 300 years ago. The Crethani demanded that their ships hold the center position because their fleet was the most technologically advanced. The Delvari insisted that only their tactical minds could be trusted to coordinate such a massive operation. Marcus listened to all of it, and his fingers moved across his datapad, and no one paid any attention to the quiet human standing in the corner. "Your species is very patient," said a voice beside him, and Marcus turned to see a young Valanthi officer watching him with curious eyes. Her scales were a lighter silver than the older officers, and she wore the insignia of a tactical analyst. "We are guests here," Marcus replied in a humble tone. "It is not our place to interrupt such important discussions." "I am Thyra Vex," the officer said, "and you are?" "Marcus. I assist the ambassador with translation and administrative matters." Thyra studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been doubt. But then another argument erupted between the Morvathi and Crethani delegations, and she turned away to observe. The first day of the summit ended with nothing accomplished except the deepening of old hatreds, and as the delegations retired to their quarters, Marcus walked 3 steps behind Ambassador Chen like a proper servant should. "This is absurd," Chen whispered once they were alone in the human quarters. "You are the most decorated military commander in human history, and they treat you like exactly what I want them to treat me as," Marcus interrupted gently. "An observer, invisible, harmless. Ambassador, I have learned more about the weaknesses of this coalition in one day than our intelligence services learned in 5 years of analysis." "And what have you learned?" Marcus set down his datapad and looked out the window at the stars, and his eyes grew hard in a way that the aliens had not seen. "I have learned that they will lose this war if someone does not take control. Their fleet coordination is a disaster. Their command structure is built on pride instead of efficiency, and they have never fought an enemy like the Harrow Swarm." "But we have," Chen said quietly. "Yes, we have. And they do not know that. They do not know anything about us because they never bothered to ask. They saw a young species with a small fleet, and they assumed we had nothing to offer." "When will you reveal yourself?" Marcus turned back to face her, and for just a moment the mask of the humble servant slipped away, and she saw the man who had broken the siege of Titan, who had held the line at Proxima when all hope seemed lost, who had never lost a fleet engagement in 30 years of service. When the time is right, when they have no choice but to listen, when their arrogance has cost them enough that they will accept help from anyone, even a primitive human servant. The next morning the summit resumed, and Marcus returned to his position near the wall with his datapad and his empty expression, and the aliens continued to ignore him as they argued about matters of honor and precedence, while the Harrow Swarm grew closer with every passing hour. Admiral Korath walked past the human delegation and stopped in front of Marcus with contempt in his eyes. "You there, servant. These glasses are empty. Take them away and bring fresh drinks for the delegates." Marcus bowed his head respectfully and took the tray of glasses, and as he turned to leave, Admiral Korath called after him. "This is the proper place for your kind human, serving your betters. Remember that." "Of course, Admiral," Marcus replied with perfect humility. "I will remember." And he would remember. He would remember every insult and every dismissal and every moment of alien arrogance, not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to understand exactly how these proud and ancient species had become so blind to the threat that was coming to devour them all. Ambassador Chen watched him go with a mixture of admiration and concern, and she wondered how much longer Marcus could maintain this disguise before something forced his hand. The answer would come sooner than any of them expected, and when it did, the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. 3 days passed aboard the throne of eternity, and the Coalition summit descended deeper into chaos with every session that convened in the Golden Command Chamber. Marcus Cole continued his role as the invisible servant, carrying trays and cleaning glasses and standing in corners where no one looked twice at him. But his eyes never stopped watching, and his datapad never stopped recording the failures he witnessed. The Morvathi delegation announced on the second day that they would withdraw their fleet unless they received supreme command of the coalition forces, and the chamber erupted into shouting that lasted for 6 hours before a temporary compromise was reached. The Crethani threatened to leave on the 3rd day when the Valanthi refused to share their shield frequency codes, calling it a matter of military security that could not be compromised even among allies. And through all of this, the Harrow Swarm continued its advance, consuming another star system while the great powers argued about honor and protocol and ancient insults that should have been forgotten centuries ago. Thyra Vex watched the human servant from across the chamber whenever she could spare a moment from her tactical duties, and the more she watched, the more her suspicions grew into something that kept her awake at night. He was wrong, she realized. Everything about him was wrong. A servant would not know to position himself at the exact spots in the room where he could observe all the main displays without being noticed. A servant would not ask low-ranking officers such detailed questions about fleet response times and ammunition reserves. A servant would not carry a datapad that displayed tactical readouts when he thought no one was looking. On the third night of the summit, Thyra sat alone in her quarters and accessed the classified intelligence networks that her position as a tactical analyst allowed her to reach. "Computer," she said, "search all available databases for any human named Marcus Cole." The search returned thousands of results, but none of them matched the quiet man she had been observing. There were scientists and artists and merchants, but no one who fit the profile of a diplomatic servant. Narrow search to human military records. "Access denied," the computer responded. "Human military databases are classified under Treaty Protocol 7 and cannot be accessed without authorization from the United Earth Defense Initiative." Thyra leaned back in her chair and felt a chill run down her spine. Why would a simple servant have classified military records? She spent the next 2 hours using every trick she knew to dig deeper into the mystery, accessing Allied intelligence reports and intercepted communications and diplomatic correspondence that she was technically not supposed to read. And then she found it. A single image in a Krathani intelligence file, captured during a human military ceremony 5 years ago. The image showed a man in a decorated uniform receiving the highest honor that humanity could bestow, and his face was the face of the servant who had been carrying trays and cleaning glasses for 3 days. The name beneath the image made her gasp. Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole, Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Initiative, hero of the Siege of Titan, defender of Proxima, the only human commander in history to have faced the Harrow swarm in combat and survived. Thyra stared at the screen for a long moment, and then she began to laugh in a way that held no humor at all. The most dangerous military mind in human space was walking among them disguised as a servant, and no one had noticed because no one had bothered to look. The next morning brought disaster. Marcus was standing in his usual corner when the alarms began to scream throughout the ship, and the floating displays in the command chamber suddenly filled with red warning symbols that made the alien delegates freeze in terror. "The swarm," Admiral Korath bellowed. "They are here, 2 days ahead of our projections." High Regent Salrath seized control of the main display, and his face went pale beneath his silver scales as he read the tactical data. "They came through the Nurith corridor. How is this possible? Our scouts reported that passage was too narrow for their hive ships." "The scouts were wrong," Admiral Korath snarled. "Or the swarm found a way. It does not matter now. We must deploy the fleet immediately." What followed was the worst display of military coordination that Marcus had ever witnessed in his long career. Orders flew in every direction as the coalition commanders tried to organize their forces, but there was no unified command structure and no agreed-upon battle plan. The Morvathi ships went one direction, while the Krathani went another. The Delvari tactical coordinators sent conflicting instructions that left entire squadrons sitting motionless while the swarm advanced. Marcus watched the displays and felt his jaw tighten as the disaster unfolded. He had predicted this exact scenario in his private notes 2 days ago, and no one had asked his opinion because no one cared what a servant thought about military strategy. "The swarm is flanking through the Nurith corridor," he said, loud enough for the officers nearby to hear. "If you do not redirect the 3rd Valanthi battle group, they will be surrounded within the hour." Admiral Korath turned to stare at the human servant with disbelief and anger in his eyes. "Did you speak to me, human?" "The Nurith corridor," Marcus repeated calmly. "Your dreadnoughts are positioned incorrectly. The swarm will use the asteroid field as cover and hit them from 3 directions at once. I have seen this tactic before." Korath crossed all 4 of his arms and looked down at Marcus with contempt. "You have seen this tactic before. You, a servant who carries empty glasses. Tell me, human, Where did a creature like you study fleet combat? I studied it in the fire of battle, Admiral. I studied it when the swarm came to our colonies 10 years ago, and we fought them alone because no one in the great galactic community thought humanity was worth saving. The chamber fell silent, and for the first time since the summit began, every eye was fixed on the quiet human in the gray clothes. Humans have fought the swarm before, Thyra asked, stepping forward with a carefully neutral expression. We have, and we won, and we learned how they think and how they attack, but none of you ever asked about that, did you? None of you ever wondered what humanity might know about the enemy you are about to face. Admiral Korath laughed, but it was a nervous sound that held no real confidence. Even if this is true, you are still a servant. You have no authority here. Return to your duties and let the real commanders handle this battle. Marcus looked at the displays showing the Velanthi battle group moving directly into the trap he had described, and he saw 3,000 lives about to be sacrificed to alien pride. As you wish, Admiral. He stepped back to his corner and watched in silence as his prediction came true. The swarm hit the third battle group from 3 directions exactly as Marcus had said they would, and the proud Velanthi dreadnoughts that had conquered 100 worlds were torn apart in minutes by the endless hunger of the Harrow fleet. 3,000 Velanthi officers died, while their admiral stood in the command chamber and refused to listen to a servant. High Regent Salrath watched the destruction with horror on his face, and when he turned to look at the human who had tried to warn them, he found only an empty corner. Marcus had already left to prepare for what came next, and Thyra Vex slipped out of the chamber to follow him, knowing that the truth she had discovered could no longer remain hidden. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity was truly capable of, and she intended to be there when the mask finally fell away. Thyra found Marcus in a small observation deck on the lower levels of the ship, a place where servants and maintenance workers took their meals away from the golden halls of the powerful. He stood alone at the window, watching the distant flashes of light that marked the ongoing battle, and he did not turn around when she entered. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole," Thyra replied, "Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Initiative, hero of the Siege of Titan, the man who held the line at Proxima when 3 colony worlds faced annihilation, the only commander in known space who has defeated the Harrow swarm in direct combat." Marcus finally turned to face her, and she saw that the humble servant mask had fallen away completely. His eyes were hard now, the eyes of a man who had sent thousands to their deaths and carried the weight of every life he could not save. "You are very thorough in your research, Tactical Analyst Vex." "Why?" Thyra demanded, stepping closer with anger and confusion fighting for control of her voice. "Why did you pretend to be a servant? Why did you let them insult you and dismiss you? Why did you not reveal yourself and take command before 3,000 of my people died?" "Because they would not have listened." "You do not know that." "I do know that. I have seen it 100 times before. When humanity first made contact with the galactic community, we sent our best diplomats and our finest officers to represent us. Do you know what happened?" Thyra shook her head. "They were dismissed without a single meeting. The Velanthi Dominion sent a message that said humanity was too young and too primitive to participate in galactic affairs, and that we should return in 1,000 years when we had proven ourselves worthy of attention. That was the decision of fools who did not understand." "It was the decision of your entire civilization," Marcus interrupted. "Every species in this coalition looked at humanity and saw children playing with technology we did not deserve. They saw a young race that had nothing to offer. They saw servants, Thyra. Even when we came dressed in our finest uniforms, with our most decorated commanders." He turned back to the window, where the flashes of battle continued to light up the darkness. "So I decided to show them what they expected to see. I dressed as a servant because that is how they would treat me regardless of what I wore. I carried trays and cleaned glasses because it allowed me to move freely and observe everything. And I waited. Waited for what? For them to fail, for their pride to cost them enough that they would accept help from anyone, even a human. I did not want your people to die, Thyra. I tried to warn Admiral Korath, but he would rather sacrifice a battle group than listen to a servant. Thyra felt sick as she understood the terrible logic of what he was saying. The Valanthi and all the other species in the coalition had created this disaster themselves through 10,000 years of arrogance and dismissal. What happens now? She asked quietly. Marcus checked his datapad, and a small smile crossed his face for the first time since she had met him. Now my fleet arrives. Your fleet, the 12 ships that the ambassador brought. That was a decoy. 12 old vessels crewed by volunteers who knew they might have to sacrifice themselves to maintain the illusion. The real fleet has been hidden in the asteroid field on the far side of the system for 2 days, running silent and waiting for my signal. Thyra felt her scales go cold as she processed this information. How many ships? 300, our newest and most advanced warships, designed specifically to fight the Harrow Swarm using everything we learned from our previous encounters. Ships that move faster than anything in the Coalition fleet. Weapons that can predict swarm attack patterns before they happen. Commanders who have trained their entire careers for this moment. You planned this, all of this, from the very beginning. I planned for the possibility. Humanity learned a long time ago that the galaxy would never accept us as equals through diplomacy or patience. The only thing that these ancient empires respect is power, and the only way to demonstrate power is to use it when it matters most. An alarm sounded throughout the ship, followed by the voice of a Valanthi communications officer. Unknown fleet emerging from the asteroid field. 300 vessels of unidentified configuration. They are transmitting on all channels. Marcus raised his datapad and spoke into it with a voice that carried the authority of a man who had commanded armies. This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole of the United Earth Defense Initiative to all coalition forces. Humanity is here to honor our alliance and defend our common cause. All vessels are to form up on the following coordinates and await further orders. Thyra watched him transform before her eyes from a quiet servant into something else entirely. Something that made her understand for the first time why humanity had survived everything the universe had thrown at them. You are taking command, she said. Someone has to. Your coalition commanders have proven they cannot work together, and the swarm will not wait for them to resolve their differences. I did not want it to happen this way, Thyra. I wanted to observe and advise and let your own leaders find their strength, but there is no more time for patience. He walked toward the door and then stopped and looked back at her. You noticed things about me that no one else did. You asked questions when everyone else was too proud to look closely at a human servant. That tells me you are exactly the kind of officer your people need. What do you want from me? Come with me to the command chamber. Watch how I coordinate this fleet. Learn everything you can. Because when this battle is over, the Valanthi will need leaders who understand that strength does not come from age or conquest or the number of worlds you control. Where does it come from? Marcus smiled, and it was not the humble smile of a servant but the fierce grin of a warrior who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. It comes from the willingness to stand beside others and fight for something greater than yourself. It comes from admitting that you do not have all the answers and learning from everyone who has something to teach. It comes from facing the darkness together instead of alone. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor, and Thyra followed him without hesitation. Behind them, through the observation window, 300 human warships burned across the darkness like a river of fire, and the Harrow Swarm that had terrorized the galaxy for a generation was about to learn that the small and primitive species they had dismissed was anything but weak. The servant was gone. The commander had arrived. And everything was about to change. The doors to the command chamber slid open and Marcus Cole walked in with Thyra at his side. And every alien in the room turned to stare at the human servant who no longer looked like a servant at all. High Regent Salreth stepped forward with confusion written across his silver face. "You, the human who carries glasses, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" "My name is Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole," Marcus announced in a voice that filled the chamber without shouting, "Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Initiative, and I am taking command of this fleet." The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before it exploded into chaos. Admiral Korath pushed through the crowd with fury burning in his eyes, all four of his arms reaching toward Marcus as if he intended to seize the human and throw him from the chamber. "This is madness. This is an insult beyond all tolerance. A human servant claims command of our sacred fleet. 3,000 of your officers died 1 hour ago because you refused to listen to that servant," Marcus replied calmly. "Do you want to lose 3,000 more while you argue about insults and honor?" "You dare." "I dare because someone must. Look at your displays, Admiral. Look at what the swarm is doing while you waste time on pride." Against his will, Korath turned to look at the tactical screens, and what he saw made his scales turn pale. The swarm had reformed after their victory over the third battle group, and was now advancing toward the main coalition fleet in a formation that would overwhelm their defensive positions within hours. "The human fleet," one of the Delvari commanders said, pointing at a cluster of new signals on the display. 300 vessels. Where did they come from?" "From the asteroid field where they have been waiting for my signal," Marcus answered. "Humanity did not send 12 ships to this battle. We sent 300 of our finest warships, crewed by officers who have trained their entire lives to fight the Harrow swarm." "You have fought them before," Salreth said slowly, remembering what Marcus had said before the disaster. "We have. 10 years ago, a swarm tendril reached our outer colonies, and we faced them alone. We lost millions of lives before we learned how to beat them, but we did learn. And everything we learned is now available to this coalition if you are willing to accept our help." The chamber fell silent as the alien commanders looked at each other, and Marcus could see the war happening behind their eyes. Their pride demanded that they reject this offer, but their fear of the swarm was growing stronger with every moment. "Why should we trust you?" the Morvathi admiral demanded, his tentacles writhing with suspicion. "You deceived us. You pretended to be a servant. How do we know this is not another trick?" "You do not know. You have no reason to trust me except for one thing. I warned Admiral Korath that the swarm would flank through the Nurith corridor, and he ignored me, and 3,000 officers died exactly as I predicted. My only deception was wearing simple clothes and staying quiet. My tactical analysis has been accurate from the beginning." "He speaks the truth," Thyra said, stepping forward to stand beside Marcus. "I have reviewed the recordings. He tried to warn us and we did not listen." Korath turned on her with rage in his eyes. "You would side with a human against your own people." "I would side with the commander who can save our fleet against the one who already lost a battle group through stubbornness. Look at the displays, Admiral. We are losing this battle. The swarm will reach the inner territories within days if we do not change our strategy immediately." Another alarm screamed through the chamber, and the displays updated to show a second swarm wave emerging from hyperspace, doubling the number of enemy vessels they faced. "We are out of time," Marcus said. "You can debate honor and trust while your civilization burns, or you can let me show you how to win. The choice is yours. But you need to make it now." High Regent Salreth looked at the displays showing the impossible odds they faced, and then he looked at the human who had walked among them as a servant, and who now stood before them as something else entirely. What do you need? Command authority over all coalition vessels, full access to your communication networks, and for everyone in this chamber to follow my orders without question until the battle is over. And if your orders lead us to destruction, then you will be no worse off than you are now. Your current strategy will result in total annihilation within 6 hours. I am offering you a chance at survival. That is all I can promise. Salreth closed his eyes and made the hardest decision of his 10,000-year reign. Do it. All coalition forces are hereby placed under the command of Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole. May the ancestors forgive me if I have made a mistake. Marcus nodded once and then he was moving, taking position at the central command console and bringing up displays that showed every ship in the combined fleet. All vessels, this is Admiral Cole. Execute formation Delta 7 and prepare for coordinated jump on my signal. Morvathi dreadnoughts, you will form the center anchor. Krethani ships, you will provide electronic warfare support on the flanks. Velanthi cruisers, fall back to secondary positions and prepare for rapid redeployment. Orders flowed from him like water, each one precise and confident, and to their own amazement the alien commanders found themselves obeying. There was something in his voice that demanded compliance, a certainty that came from decades of experience and hundreds of battles. Human fleet, this is Cole. Execute Omega Protocol. Show them what we built. On the displays, the 300 human ships suddenly accelerated to speeds that made the alien commanders gasp. They moved through the swarm formation like predators hunting prey, their weapons firing with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. How are they predicting the swarm movements? A Delvari officer asked with wonder in her voice. Pattern recognition algorithms built from 10 years of combat data, Marcus replied without looking up from his console. The swarm are not random. They follow instinctive behaviors that can be analyzed and anticipated. We learned their patterns by paying attention while the rest of the galaxy ignored them. The battle shifted as the human fleet tore through the swarm's flanks, and for the first time since the fighting began, the alien commanders saw hope on their displays. Admiral, Thyra said, pointing at a massive signature at the center of the swarm formation, the Queen's flagship, if we can destroy it. The swarm will fragment and lose coordination, Marcus finished. I know. That is exactly what we are going to do. All ships prepare for attack pattern Omega. We end this now. That is suicide, Admiral Korath protested. The Queen's flagship is surrounded by 1,000 vessels. We cannot reach it. Marcus looked up from his console and met the Admiral's eyes. Watch us. He opened a channel to his personal ship, a destroyer called the Defiant that had been hiding among the human fleet. Captain Tors, bring the Defiant to the front. I will command the final assault personally. Admiral, you cannot, Salrith began. I can and I will. Humanity does not ask others to take risks that we will not take ourselves. That is why we win, High Regent. That is what your ancient empires never understood about us. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at the stunned alien commanders. Follow my lead or stay behind. But the Defiant is going through that swarm fleet, and we are going to kill the Queen. Anyone who wants to see how humans fight is welcome to join us. He walked out, and after a moment of hesitation, Thyra followed him. Behind them, display screens showed the human fleet forming up for the final assault, and the Harrow swarm that had never known defeat was about to learn the meaning of fear. The Defiant burned through the darkness of space with 300 human ships at her back, and behind them came the alien fleet, following the servant who had become a commander into the greatest battle the galaxy had ever seen. Marcus stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the displays that showed the Swarm Queen's flagship at the center of 1,000 enemy vessels, and he felt the familiar calm that always came to him in the moments before combat. All ships, this is Admiral Cole. The swarm fights through instinct and numbers. They expect us to attack their outer defenses and wear ourselves down before we can reach the Queen. We are not going to do what they expect. On the tactical display, the human fleet split into 12 groups that began weaving through the swarm formation in patterns that seemed chaotic, but were actually precisely calculated. The swarm cannot adapt quickly to unexpected movements. When they face a threat they have not seen before, their reaction time slows while the Queen processes new information and sends updated commands. We are going to give them so many unexpected threats that their entire network locks up. Captain Torres, the commander of the Defiant, watched her admiral with admiration and concern. "Sir, we are going directly at the flagship. The shields will not hold against that much firepower." "They do not need to hold, they just need to hold long enough." The battle became a storm of light and fire as the human ships danced through the swarm formation, striking targets and then vanishing before the enemy could respond. The alien commanders watching from the throne of eternity had never seen anything like it. "How are they doing this?" Admiral Korath demanded, his earlier anger replaced by something that might have been respect. "No fleet can move with such coordination." "They trained for this," Thyra replied, watching the displays with wide eyes. "For 10 years, while we dismissed them as primitives, they were learning and preparing and building a military force designed specifically to fight the enemy we refuse to acknowledge." The Defiant reached the outer edge of the Queen's defensive sphere, and the swarm vessels turned to face this new threat. 100 enemy ships against one human destroyer. "Evasive pattern Theta," Marcus ordered calmly. "Divert all power from weapons to shields and engines. We are not here to fight. We are here to get close." The Defiant twisted and rolled through a hurricane of enemy fire, her shields flaring with each impact but holding through skill and determination. Marcus watched the distance counter on his display dropping as they drew closer to the Queen's flagship. "Coalition fleet," he broadcast on all channels. "Now is the time. The swarm is focused on us. Hit their flanks with everything you have." For a moment nothing happened, and Marcus wondered if the alien commanders would let their pride cost them the battle. But then the displays lit up with thousands of weapons signatures as the Morvathi and Crethani and Velanthi ships finally committed to the fight. The swarm formation shuddered as it tried to respond to threats from every direction at once, and Marcus saw exactly what he had been waiting for. "There," he said, pointing at a gap that had opened in the defensive sphere. "All human ships converge on Sector 7. The Queen is exposed." The human fleet responded instantly, flowing toward the gap like water finding a crack in a dam, and the Defiant led the charge with Marcus standing at the front of the bridge, watching the Queen's flagship grow larger on the screens. "Weapons range in 30 seconds, Captain Torres announced. "Lock all torpedoes on the Queen's central reactor core. We get one shot at this." The swarm realized too late what was happening. Vessels rushed to close the gap, but the human ships were too fast, slipping through the defenses and opening fire with everything they had. The Defiant's torpedoes struck the Queen's flagship at the same moment as weapons from a dozen other human ships, and the massive vessel that had commanded the destruction of 17 star systems erupted into a ball of fire that lit up the entire battlefield. For a long moment, nothing moved. And then the swarm began to fall apart. Without the Queen's coordinating intelligence, the individual swarm vessels lost their unified purpose. Some continued attacking blindly while others fled in random directions. The terrifying precision that had made them unstoppable was gone. "All ships," Marcus broadcast, his voice steady despite the exhaustion he felt, "pursue and destroy. Do not let them regroup. This ends today." The coalition fleet swept through the disorganized swarm like a cleansing fire, and by the time the battle ended 3 hours later, the enemy that had threatened to consume, The galaxy was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing into deep space. Marcus sat down in the captain's chair for the first time since the battle began, and he let himself feel the weight of everything that had happened. "Admiral," Captain Torres said quietly, "the High Regent is requesting your presence on the throne of eternity. He says the Coalition wishes to thank you. Tell him I will be there soon. I need a moment." He looked at the displays showing the debris field where the Swarm Queen's flagship had been, and he thought about all the lives that had been lost on both sides. 3,000 Valanthi in the first attack, hundreds of humans in the final assault, and millions more across the 17 systems the Swarm had already consumed. Victory always came with a price. An hour later, Marcus walked into the command chamber of the Throne of Eternity, and this time no one mistook him for a servant. His simple gray clothes were burned and torn from the battle, and there was blood on his face from a wound he had not bothered to treat, but he walked with the same quiet confidence he had carried since the moment he first stepped onto this ship. High Regent Salrath stood at the center of the chamber with the other coalition leaders arranged behind him, and as Marcus approached, the ancient ruler of the Valanthi Dominion did something that no human had ever seen before. He bowed. "Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole, on behalf of the Valanthi Dominion and all the species of this coalition, I offer our deepest gratitude and our sincerest apologies. We dismissed your people as primitives, and we treated you as servants, and you responded by saving our civilization from destruction." Marcus looked at the assembled leaders and saw shame and respect, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I did not do this for gratitude or apologies, High Regent. I did this because the Harrow Swarm was a threat to every living being in this galaxy, and fighting them alone was never going to be enough. Humanity learned that lesson the hard way 10 years ago. I hope that working together might teach the Coalition the same thing." "You could have let us fail," Admiral Korath said, stepping forward with difficulty. It clearly cost him something to say these words. "After how we treated you, no one would have blamed you for taking your fleet and leaving us to our fate." "That is not who we are, Admiral. Humanity does not measure strength by the age of our civilization or the number of our conquests. We measure it by our willingness to stand with others when they need us, even when they do not deserve it." Thyra watched from the edge of the chamber as the coalition leaders formally requested that humanity take a permanent seat on the Galactic Defense Council, not as observers, but as full partners with equal voice and equal authority. When the ceremony was over, she approached Marcus as he prepared to return to his ship. "What will you do now, Admiral?" Marcus smiled, and for just a moment she saw a flash of the humble servant who had carried trays and cleaned glasses. "Go home, mostly. Sleep for a week. Try to remember what it feels like to not be responsible for the fate of the galaxy. You changed everything today. The Coalition will never be the same." That was always the plan. Sometimes you have to lose your illusions before you can see clearly. The ancient empires needed to fail before they could learn, and humanity needed to prove ourselves before anyone would listen. He picked up an empty glass from a nearby table and looked at it thoughtfully. "I learned something these past few days too. I learned that even the proudest and most stubborn people can change when they are given a reason. The Valanthi and the others are not bad, Thyra. They are just old and set in their ways. With the right leadership, they might become something better." "Leadership like yours." "Leadership like yours. I will not live forever, and humanity cannot carry this coalition on our backs. We need allies who understand what we understand, officers who see strength in cooperation instead of conquest. You noticed me when no one else did. You asked questions when everyone else was too proud. That makes you exactly the kind of leader this galaxy needs." He set down the glass and walked toward the exit, pausing at the door to look back one last time. "The galaxy thought we were servants. Let them keep thinking that if they want. Humanity has always done our best work when no one was watching." And with that, the man who had saved the coalition walked away, leaving behind a galaxy that would never look at his species the same way again. The servant had taught the masters a lesson they would never forget.